So how was that fire started? So we have a 3-year-old kid in the apartment. I mean, what do kids do? Kids like to explore. They like to touch things. I mean, I was involved in many, many years in lead paint poisoning cases. What happens? Little kids go to the wall, they see something, they pick at it because they like exploring. So this kid in this apartment liked to turn on the stove. So he would play with the stove. His mother would smack his hand, try to tell him not to do it, not to do it, not to do it. Kids are what they are. Kids find a way to be mischievous. Kids find a way to do things, which is why we put locks on stuff. We lock cabinet doors when they're young because they can crawl and get into them, right? So this child, when the mother was in the shower, was able to physically turn on the stove. As I said before, there was a chicken on the stove in a pot, cabinets above caught fire, and the rest, as we say, is history. So why is it that stoves can be made that a 3-year-old is able to turn it on? Shouldn't they be made in such a manner that a 3-year-old can't turn it on, or that something can impede their ability to turn it on? Now, when I got involved in that case, I researched other fires where either a child or something else turned on the stove. And believe it or not, there are several cases where houses have been burnt to the ground because a pet was able to turn on the stove. There was one case in Connecticut involving a dog. There was a pizza box that was left on top of the range of the stove, and the dog was jumping up, was able to turn on the stove by moving the valve that you turn on the stove. So how do you turn on the stove? You're supposed to be able to push in and turn. Well, going back, believe it or not, to 1980 or so, there were designs that the manufacturers such as GE, Whirlpool, all had, and they knew about this problem, which would have made it more difficult for a child to turn it on, meaning either they were stoves that were prototypes where the stove mechanism turn on was behind the stove. So it wasn't so easy to get access to it. Think of a stove for a minute, it's in front. You have to reach over behind. It's not as easy to be able to turn on that a child couldn't reach over, or a dog jumping up couldn't turn it on. They knew about this problem, yet they decided, for economy's sake and because it costs too much money, not to manufacture stoves in that manner. So even assuming that that's not what you want to do because of whatever reason, the aesthetics of it doesn't look good, there are ways to make the stove, to turn it on, harder by making it harder to push in. So when you think about how you turn on a stove, most of the stoves you have to push in a little bit and then turn till you hear a click. That click opens up a valve in the stove that lets gas in, which turns on the stove. There is something called pounds per pressure. That pounds per pressure essentially means how much force you have to use to push that in and turn the stove on. So they have made it easier over the years to turn on a stove. It used to be that you had to push harder to turn on the stove. People either complained about it, or there were some times when there were complaints involving elderly people who may not have the strength to turn it on. And that's why they kept making it easier, despite the fact that they knew that being able to turn it on easier, a child, a pet, something else could occur to turn on the stove. So after this fire that I just told you about, the Prospect Avenue fire, and even before that, there are these, like, best way to describe it, plastic caps that can be placed over the stove that you have to have an extra degree of strength in order to turn it on. As a matter of fact, in New York City, because of my case, it's now required that if a child under the age of 7 is living in the apartment, you must have these plastic covers put over the valves, which make it a second step to turn on the stove, which would prevent a 3-year-old who probably couldn't figure it out, because you do have to do 2 steps. It's a 2-step mechanism to turn on that stove. So that involved what we call product liability law, which is essentially, how is it designed? Could it be designed better? Could it be designed safer? Why didn't the manufacturer do it in that fashion? What were the reasons the manufacturer didn't do it? And 98% of the time, manufacturers don't do it because they don't want to spend the money on it. They don't want to spend the money on it because it costs too much money to do, or if they have a prototype, they want to follow the prototype to get the factory to redo it in such a manner it was going to cost too much money. And unfortunately, people die from these type of things. So these caps, which, as I say, are now mandated every year, I get a notification from my landlord saying, do you have a child under the 7 living in the apartment? Because if you do, we have to put caps over the stove. But they are also available on the internet as an aftermarket type of item. So now they're required. Again, they're required because of the case that I did. New York City requires them. I don't think other cities require them, but New York City definitely does. And it's a safety factor. I mean, our office is involved in so many fires that I'm always amazed that how many fires occur and how little is done to actually educate the public on it. If I could get up on my high horse for a minute. So the real question that I've always asked is, why aren't there sprinklers? Right? I mean, what's the point of what's a sprinkler for? The sprinkler senses heat, right? That's what a sprinkler does. There's a little sensor on it. Once it senses the heat, water comes down. It can be put out, and you can put out a fire in, 30 seconds? So why is it that we don't have sprinklers in buildings? And the answer is money. That's the answer. In New York City, in the 1980s, there was a proposal after a major fire that occurred to put sprinklers, to retrofit buildings with sprinklers. And landlords and their lobby killed the bill, saying it would cost billions and billions of dollars to retrofit all the buildings. It would be too much of a chore. So instead, in all seriousness, how many years now? So 1980, what year is this? So 60 years later, how many years? 40 years later, people are dying and getting burnt because landlords didn't want to put in sprinklers. So instead, they have to deal with, and their insurance companies have to deal with, fires that occur. And it was a major thing in the 1980s when Rudolph Giuliani was mayor. He was actually one of the ones that proposed it. And then he ended up not agreeing to it because he got too much backlash from the landlords about putting in sprinklers. If every building was built with a sprinkler, we wouldn't be having a conversation now. The conversation would be over because nobody would die. So again, it's about money. It's about landlords not wanting to do things for safety purposes. And if they did, how many lives would be saved? So we're just involved in so many fires. And I'm always amazed that why they occur, how they occur, and how they're preventable. And despite me doing this with you and other people and being interviewed on television about fires, there's a fire every other day in New York City.